Right then, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for our penultimate session. We're moving now, perhaps back to the policy and political landscape in healthcare. 1 year, or is it in fact 11 months, from the 2015 general election. We've obviously touched on some of these themes in most of our sessions today, but I'm really delighted to be joined by three splendid colleagues. Nick Timmins, who's a Senior Fellow of the King's Fund and the Institute for Government. Nick formerly was the Public Policy Editor of the Financial Times. These days he's more or less a chronicler of the various aspects of public policy. Nick wrote the definitive account of the 2012 Act reforms, a book called Never Again, which I can't recommend to you highly enough if you ever have those moments of thinking, what the hell happened there? Then, you know, Never Again is where you'll find the answer. Randeep, Ramesh, the Social Affairs Editor of The Guardian. Many of you will probably remember the excellent live blog that was done on the NHS reforms, and Randeep was the principal author of that, and I only say it's excellent. Firstly, because it is. Secondly, because I used to occasionally quote some of the stuff that I write on there, so obviously it's thoroughly marvellous. David Walker is an independent journalist. David's also a contributing editor of The Guardian's Public magazine. And David was the Director of Communications for the Audit Commission. So we've got three superb sets of perspectives on the policy and political landscape. So each of the speakers is going to give us a few minutes initially of their view of the lie of the land currently, and where we're going in a general election environment, and where we might go beyond that. And then we'll follow that with discussions, observations, comments, questions, and answers. So, Nick, can I ask you to kick off?
Yes, sure.
Wherever you come.
Hi, good to see you. Pretty far away, but we'll do our very best. Well, I don't know, 4 minutes, very brief. Well, we're a year away from the election, and the truth is we have absolutely no idea who will win. The bookies say it's going to be a hung parliament, but I think the truth is that any result is possible, from a Conservative victory to a Labour one, and for a whole bunch of reasons. One is that famous quote of Macmillan's about events, dear boy, events. Who knows what's going to happen between now and the expiry of the current 11 months that we're just entering into. There's something called the euro out there, which has gone very, very quiet, but if you think the euro problem has been solved, and it has, that will come back to bite the UK pretty hard. And there's, of course, the minor question of UKIP. Well, I think the one thing that the European elections demonstrated was that whilst clearly they may do more damage to the Tories, they may also do some damage to Labour, and there's kind of 20-something odd three-way marginal seats, and you have no idea how the vote will break down there and what outcome that will have. And in a close election, that could have a significant impact on the outcome. As for the NHS, well, why don't we start with some good news? I think if we'd all been sitting here in 2010 and been told that the NHS was going to have flat growth, real terms growth for the next 4 years, where would we think it would be? And I think the answer would be in a lot worse place than it is now. Activity's gone up, despite the fact that it's flat real terms growth, and it's clearly true, it's clearly self-evident signs of strain are beginning to show, but it's actually performed pretty well, given the environment in which I think most people predicted it would be far worse. Why has that happened? Well, I think a crucial element has been the public sector pay freeze, which has taken a huge amount of pressure off on pay. And there has to be a question, and we'll probably get around to this about what happened after the election, there has to be a question about how long that can hold and in what circumstances it starts to change. Particularly if you think you're looking at flat real terms growth going out, or something even less beyond the next election in the name of deficit reduction. It's worth the other thing that people tend to say, well, I hear people tend to say, is actually local government's taken a 25% hit over the last 4 years and has done pretty well. Services are not entirely falling apart, and I think that's true in a lot of areas, but it's clearly not entirely true in social care, where compared to 2010, 25% fewer people are getting support than they were, and that's clearly starting to have an increasing knock-on impact on the NHS, both in terms of patients coming in and not being able to get patients out. As for the NHS money, well, it's clearly sort of slowly drifting towards deficit. It's chiefly a question of when the NHS as a whole goes into deficit. Is it this year or is it next year? This year the books might balance overall, but there'll clearly be a growing number of organisations in deficit in one form or another. And of course there's a winter to come. And winter is entirely unpredictable. If winter's good or winter's bad, that will make a huge difference to the perception about how the NHS is doing going into the election. Again, that's unpredictable. Slightly further forward in the current policy contracts, there's the Better Care Fund, which presents the National Health Service with a dilemma. Kind of 3.8 billion quid being pooled, most of it is NHS money. I think the NHS attitude to this is wonderfully schizophrenic in the sense that it kind of knows it's the right thing to do because it's trying to integrate services that need to be integrated, but it is predicated on the Better Care Fund not only reducing emissions, but reducing them on a large scale, and then reducing in ways that allow human trust to release cash. And it's quite difficult to see how that will happen over the short term. So the plans have been reviewed, and that's all very sensible. But it does potentially, particularly for acute trust, present a big problem for next year. What other is knocking around? Well, we have a new Chief Executive of NHS England, Simon Stevens, who says he's going to produce a paper in the autumn. Its precise purpose is not entirely clear. One assumes it's going to try and set out a strategy for the NHS over the next 4 or 5 years on various funding scenarios, which presumably as a subtext will say, well, this much we can do and this much without more money we can't. But quite how that will be framed, I think, is still open. One more, just a bit about political parties' positioning, I'll shut up. Hunt, whatever else you think about him, has proved an extremely smooth and effective operator. No one talks about Lansley or the Lansley reforms anymore in government. It's all gone quiet over there. We talk about patients and services. And I suspect the services will probably try to go as quietly as possible about the NHS between now and the election. Labour doubtless will shout loudly as possible. And it's interesting Andy Burnett is banging on about the reforms. I think that plays as a big issue within the NHS. I'm not sure it plays as such a big issue with the public anymore. By the time you get to May 2015, it'll be 3 years ago, and banging on about the costs of all this, I'm not sure will cut as much ice necessarily with the electorate as he might hope. And then there's the Lib Dems dilemma. How much do they claim credit for what has happened, or how much do they distance themselves from where it is? So that's a brief overview of where I think we are and where we might be going.
Thank you very much. David?
I thought I'd offer you very briefly 3 C's, and it's really following on from Nick, looking perhaps at the next few months through the eyes of the people you may be dealing with, executives in NHS trusts. First C, very obviously from their point of view, is chaos. The NHS appears to be a system that is no longer a system. Take regulation. It's CQC saying one thing, monitors saying something else. We hear that the 2 organisations are at loggerheads, and then of course there is a quasi-regulator in the shape of NHS England. At the level of the trust, it is a real problem to decipher regulatory rules, which are sometimes, it seems, being made up on the hoof, so that one week you will get CQC inspections doing one thing, literally the next week, if you're running a multiplicity of services, you'll have CQC inspectors saying almost diametrically opposed things, and that makes for a degree, at the very least, of anxiety on the part of those who are charged with delivering. And of course the recent mantra has to be quality. You'll know this from your interaction with NHS people, which word covers patient safety, which has become the great priority, to the extent that, in some of the trusts I look at, money is almost secondary. And that's hugely paradoxical, given what Nick was saying about the aggregates for the future NHS, that patient safety for the moment means covering your back in case you get a busload of CQC inspectors coming around and they find something they don't like, yet you don't know in advance what that something might be. Second C is, again, a word which may be familiar with those of you who are in and out of NHS organisations, and that's SIPS, which stands, you will know, for Cost Improvement, I have to look this up, Cost Improvement Programme Strategy. Now, SIPs are the stepchildren, financially speaking, of the Nicholson Challenge, Nicholson's demand that the NHS save some £20 billion over the period between 2010 and 2015. At a trust level, it means trying to squeeze efficiencies out of your budget. At the same time as those who commission your services are also trying to squeeze savings for efficiency, except, as you know, commissioners call SIPs quip. quality, innovation, productivity and prevention. Those of you who are theologians of the NHS will perhaps afterwards explain to me quite what the difference between QUIP and SIPs are. However, at the trust level, it does mean huge pressure. And if I just may briefly refer to the budget of, I won't name it, but an NHS trust which happens to provide 1,000 beds, projected savings for 2014-15 onwards, 7.7%, 6.9%, 5.7%, etc. In one of those years, that degree of savings under the SIPs rubric would require, given that so much of the NHS budget goes on staff costs, taking 90 million out of pay costs, equivalent to 275 to 300 whole-time equivalents. That degree of staff contraction in an NHS, which is being required to put more nurses to work in the direction of patients, looks like and feels to many like an impossible task. Which is why, thirdly, my third C is change. I won't say that all people who work in the NHS are Labour supporters, they clearly aren't, but at the moment there certainly is a huge building anticipation of the possibility of political change at Westminster in 2015, which could bring to power a government perceived by those who work in the NHS as more sympathetic both to the NHS and to funding regimes which would buy, in their view, quality care. I won't say that Andy Burnham is lionised, he's not, by NHS people, but that expectation that there could be change is building up. And of course, if in the event a Conservative-led government is returned, that would at the very least cause a huge wave of dismay and I think departures, because as you'll know from the figures, a lot of people are reaching retirement age in a service which has an ageing demographic, and that could precipitate a large outflow as early as June 2015. Okay.
Randeep.
Thanks very much, Andy. To be controversial, I think actually the Conservatives possibly stand to profit most from the changes that they have enforced upon the NHS in the political battle to come ahead before the election. I say this because I think Labour is trying to position itself as the party of the NHS, quite rightly one might say, given its historical legacy. But the Tories, if you read Jeremy Hunt's speech from the last Conservative conference, contains this very powerful phrase, "We will be the party of the patients." And there are far more patients than there are people who work in the NHS. How to defend the stingiest NHS allocation for half a century is the Tories' problem, and the way they will do it is by looking at what bang you're getting for your buck. It's a neat strategy because it plays into a very emotional part of what the NHS is. You can see that debate being played out in Wales at the moment, and if anyone watched the last question time, where the audience turned on the Labour member for what they perceived as a lack of service delivery from the NHS, it was quite telling, and it should run shivers down the spine of most Labour politicians. Because our expectations for service delivery far outstrip anything most public services can deliver. You only have to look at the state of the Passport Office to tell yourself that. There isn't the money for capital infrastructure, the public services are generally or traditionally unresponsive. How will that change in an NHS which has very little money to spend? And come 2015-2020 may have even less. Unless welfare, the army is shrunk, and we give up on climate change. I'm not quite sure if other departments are willing to take that sort of pain in order to fund an NHS, or a Dilmore-style proposal that provides it with relief from bed blocking in its hospitals. So the two major parties between them have very different messages to sell, I would contest. Within them there are streams. There are modernisers within the Conservative Party who see the threat that Labour pose in positioning themselves as a healthcare producer party. Someone like Sam Gimaya, who's very close to David Cameron, arch moderniser, mother was a nurse, spends a lot of his time, if you follow his Twitter feed, hanging around in hospitals and doing the PR that's required by politicians to show they care for frontline activity. And that's important because the current model of the Tory advance into Labour territory is to use the Francis report to back the raising of nurse numbers. So the Tories have played that quite well. I mean, you've got to give them credit for the pivot that they managed to achieve after the pause, transforming a toxic argument into propaganda victory. And that's been running for more than a year. I don't see that changing. Labour's problem is that it's all tactics and no strategy. As my colleagues have said, Simon Stevens, when he appeared before MPs, made it very clear, they will need more money come November. His report magically will appear around October, the autumn statement will be in November, and George Osborne, if history is any guide, will produce more cash. Where that comes from, we don't know. Thereafter, the question will be, who gets that cash? There are all sorts of competing factions in the NHS. I dare say it won't end up in wages. That will be one place we won't see. And the public sector unions will have nothing to gain. They'll have a very fearsome campaign, which Labour will back, but I don't see it playing well in the electorate. Labour's policy, for me, is kind of in tatters. They don't really have one. They have their tactical advance, which is more money, and then they have the idea that there should be less competition. Now, you all sell to the NHS, and you all tell me that half of all what was PCT budgets and now is TCC budgets is off tariff anyway. So will the pain be borne by people like you, or will it be borne through the national tariff for operations, currently being reviewed by Monitor? Well, anyone who's sat through or tried to work out the finances of the NHS know that's a fool's errand, because in order to stop hospitals from going bust, there is a series of currency re-evaluations just before a disaster strikes in any hospital. That usually means paying people more for operations they were getting paid for less 3 months earlier. So, to me, it's a political problem, this, about who claims credit where there is any good evidence in the NHS, and I think that will be the Tories, paradoxically, and I think Labour, unless they come up with a policy, and this is where I think they do have room for it, and it is actually about what Norman Lamb spoke earlier today, it's about the governance of CCGs. Labour could quite easily score a victory. As we've seen, I don't know if anyone's heard the news today, but Bristol CCG has had to back down over the fact it didn't listen to its patients as it was required to by the law in setting its policy, spending policy and spending plans. There, for me, lies Labour's entry into the NHS, getting on the side of patients, enforcing consumer will over a producer. That's where the game is to be won for Labour. They show no sign at all of adopting it.
Thank you. That's really fascinating perspectives on the current situation.
I think we heard something about the challenges of flying the plane while you're still building it, in terms of the sheer challenges of delivering these reforms in a completely new system. I think there is a phrase which I'm hearing a lot in and around the NHS at the moment, which is, if I've got to be hung for something, I'd rather be hung for the money than for the quality. And that's informing people's decisions to hire more nurses, hire more full-time staff. Monitor released some figures recently showing, I think I may have mentioned this earlier today, that the NHS is spending £1.4 billion a year on agency staff, a mighty sum. So to pick up a couple of issues that were common across the conversations there. The Simon Stevens factor. Simon Stevens has been endowed with almost godlike capacity to solve this fascinating, complex set of problems. And as has been outlined, he's set out this financial review, which is due to report in the autumn. To what extent do you all think that he has come in with massive political capital from the Conservative-led administration that appointed him, and he still enjoys vast political capital with much of the Labour Party? Is your sense that he's like, political capital, as Andrew Lansley painfully discovered, you can only spend it once, really? Is your sense that Simon Stevens' political capital, as the Chief Executive of NHS England, is something he is likely to spend on a conversation with the government about more money as soon as this autumn? David?
Two things. I mean, one, unlike his predecessor, he is at best, primus inter pares. From a trust point of view, you're as much attentive now, given what you said about that trade-off between patient safety and quality and money, you're going to be as much attentive to David Bean, Chief Executive of the CQC, or David Bennett, Chief Executive of Monitor, as you are to NHS England and Simon Stevens at its head. So his objective position is a lot less powerful than I think his predecessor David Nicholson. I think almost regardless of what he does or doesn't do during the next few months, the funding of the NHS, as Randeep said, possibly in terms of the possibility of Osborne's autumn statement, has become so political, so much a potential subject for the next election, that it'll be considered and dealt with as a House of Commons partisan political activity. And the objective case that someone like Simon Stevens might make will go by the board, because politicians' antennae will be so attuned to the potential of that issue on the doorsteps in terms of UKIP and so on and so forth, that what an expert might say to them will be of secondary consideration.
I think Simon Stevens is there as an advocate. I mean, that's what he's banging the drum for the NHS, and funding is the biggest part of that. I think his real problem is whether he can have the sorts of conversations he'd like to have with the Labour leadership. I mean, I think he's in tune with much of what Jeremy Hunt says. I see him much more as a Blairite, Miliband, Hunt reformer than the messages of no competition in the NHS that we hear from the leadership of the Labour Party. Although his heart might be in that place, his mind seems to be wandering in the other way. And anyone who reads his speeches, I can't see a Labour policy in them. And I think that the other difference between David Nicholson is that David, before he left, was very keen to get CCGs to outline what they were going to do for him, and thereby use the big stick to ensure they did it, or set in train enough shackles that they would be forced to do so. I don't think Simon Stevens will do that. He's much more of an experimental localist agenda. That will be the big difference in terms of what CCGs will be able to do, and therefore what hospitals will be able to do. Remember that they're the mediator in this. And I think that will be the interesting thing. Local experiments under Stevens, and that they will be used to highlight best practice, I suspect.
I agree with a lot of that. The interesting question is whether the NHS can respond to that sort of an agenda. Because we've heard, David Nicholson used to wander around saying, look out, and people still look up. So they say, well, you want us to do these things, how do we go about doing it, what permission do we need?
How would you like
But
us to be
I do suspect that in Science Stevens' agenda is a lot more experimentation of all sorts about if people are prepared to give it a go. So you could see everything from sort of really genuine vertical integration in some places, with GPs actually getting into bed with the acute trust, and you try and run a fully integrated system all the way through, to CCGs that he's already said he wants to have conversations with the CCGs about running the GP budget, which of course technically NHS England does now. So I think there's a lot of interest in trying something different, and personally I think that's really rather a good idea. I think they'll well evaluate it. It's not going to be a sort of 1,000 flowers blue. I mean, no one's going to be allowed to run away and do anything they want. But I do think there's an interest in trying to see if you could evolve different models of care in different ways in different places, for the merits of trying them in their own right, and both because local places are different locally. Some things will work better in rural areas or different parts of the country depending on the configuration. And that's all quite encouraging. So I think one of the we sort of watched NHS reform over the last God knows how many years. We do this terrible tendency to say everyone's got to do the same thing at the same time on the same day, and it's all going to change like that. And that it's quite refreshing if there's going to be something that's a bit more experimental.
Well, except at the same time as that happened, you had an institution in the NHS, the Foundation Trust, which had been, we thought, designed to be capable of local innovation.
Yeah.
What's been happening recently is the reduction in the sphere of autonomy which Foundation Trusts have. They have become very much creatures of Monitor, who say to them, you will budget this way, you will spend this amount, you will make the following trade-offs between quality and expenditure. And the performance management of FTs has now been built into the system in a way that it wasn't until recently.
It's the mid-staffs effect, isn't it?
Yep, which is comes back to that point about can the NHS do it if, will it be able to do it if it wants to do it? Just on the issue of money, I mean, if there is more money in November, it should be sticking plaster money and it'll get you through the election money.
Get through winter.
Yeah, there's a much more fundamental and underlying question about what the NHS budget is going to look like going forward. And if you look at what the Conservatives are proposing, which is to reimburse the deficit for 2018, and the scale of cuts for other departments, if the NHS gets real terms growth, is huge. So there's a very, very big underlying question about the determination to see that through after an election by whichever party wins, or whether the other parties think they can actually slow down the rate of deficit reduction and raise some more tax. I mean, there's plenty of economic commentators who think the taxes are going to go up after the next election anyway, whoever wins, simply to get the deficit down and to...
With a recovering economy, we will see the tax take rise, and there'll be more money than I think, and that will be the good news message that the Chancellor will be wanting to run into the election, and that therein lies a sort of bit of relief for the NHS. But I think you're right, no one would want to win this election, given what comes after it, especially in terms of social care, which, as Nick sort of says, is a train crash.
I mean, a couple of points from earlier today. In the London panel, we had Robert Naylor and Ruth Carnell and Claire Gerarda and Nick Samuels. And there seemed to be a fair degree of consensus that we need to move towards something more like the accountable care organisation model, so it's a capitated budget for a defined set of population. And actually, I asked the delegates in our first session today, does anyone believe that taxes will... The politicians are saying that they do not propose to put taxes up after the next general election. I asked for a show of hands from anyone who believed that was true, and there were no hands raised. Just on the Simon Stevens point, so for many reasons, Simon Stevens reminds me of Monty Python's Life of Brian, for a couple of reasons. He's being treated, you must have noticed this, he's being treated with this kind of wild reverence and as this kind of saviour figure. And to such a point, I started referring to him at one point as Simon Stevens, a very naughty boy. And those of you who are familiar with the film Life of Brian will know that the Brian character is mistaken for Christ, and his mother turns around to his followers and she says, "He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy." So, and also, as Nick's point about kind of Stockholm syndrome, the NHS is extremely used to being shouted at from the centre about what to do. And there is a bit in the film where he's telling his followers, you're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. You've all got to think for yourselves. Yes, we've all got to think for yourselves. And he says, now, Foxtrot Oscar. The obvious implication. And they sort of stand there, and then they go, how shall we Foxtrot Oscar? That could potentially be the dilemma that the NHS faces, that, you open the cage doors, you've been under the Nicholson top-down control command model, and freedom. What do we do with that then? What do we do with freedom? Nobody, in their sort of thoughts about the run-up to the next election, mentioned the Liberal Democrats, and I don't know if that's to say to save their intrusion on private grief, or is it because we can't discern a Liberal Democrat health policy?
Because there might not be enough Liberal Democrats to have a health minister.
Nick?
Well, we can discern, we can't, because Norman Lamb said the other day that he will make it compulsory for a legal requirement to integrate budgets.
Which of course means a top-down reorganisation of the NHS, because if you change the arrangements on governance and oversight, then you've just got rid of CCGs and health and wellbeing boards.
Well, I read that as this little change that the Liberal Democrats argued for when the bill was going through, which was to make CCGs under health and wellbeing boards, so health and wellbeing boards would be able to direct. And that, to me, that isn't a very big change. In fact, the Labour Party kind of agreed. So I do think the governance arrangements is where the opposition party, like the Lib Dems, the Labour, the centre-left, could make some of the running, because that is the lacuna in the Tory agenda, which has not been very well thought of in terms of local oversight. If you're going to have a local NHS, then you do need some sort of democratic bit of it. And foundation trusts founded in the same way. They're membership organisations. The membership are kind of they're an appendage, really. I mean,
Well, FTs, and I think that's probably correct. I mean, FTs have more members than all of the major Westminster political parties put together. There are more people who are members of the Foundation Trust. Perhaps it's not a very meaningful engagement, but statistically it's true. David, how popular is local democracy? Remind me of what the participation rates are in local elections versus general elections.
You're lucky if you get 28%, and you're very, very lucky if you get sort of 33%. So the idea that local government brings some extra level of legitimacy, given that turnout still for parliamentary elections is of the order of 65+%, suggests a lot of people talk about localism, but if I may, I mean, you may have heard from my accent that I am a blown away Scot, and we clearly do have in September an event which will have major consequences for the NHS, whichever way the vote goes. Clearly, if Scotland becomes an independent country, its health service, however constituted, would be a different animal. And so the 1948 settlement would be sundered forever because of that. If, however, a majority of Scottish residents vote to stay in the United Kingdom, it's likely that there will be quite a high vote saying yes to independence, and that's going to further empower the Scottish Government, which at the moment is nationalist, to sort of think about doing things differently. And I think that NHS brand, which still obviously exists in Scotland, will come under, I mean, from an NHS point of view, pressure perhaps to be more NHS in Scotland than in England. But I think the differentiation of the NHS within the UK, with all sorts of consequences for contracting, for purchasing, and so on and so forth, will grow regardless of the vote. But bluntly, to answer your question, the idea that local government can be the saviour of health provision, the answer is look at schools.
Apart from the Catholics, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, on the Scots point, there's already a huge divergence between what's going on in Scotland and what's going on in New Wales. I mean, the Scots, if I say this, the Scots get really, really cross. But in one level, they've actually set out to prove that the pre-1991 NHS can work, and they get very cross and say that's because they're with all sorts of things as well. But it's kind of basic, it's the basic truth. So there's huge divergence already, and it will get, it's clearly getting greater post-Lansley and what's followed with all that. Health and wellbeing boards. If you go for integration and health and wellbeing, who becomes the commissioner? Do you end up with? So if you want to integrate not just the budget, but the commissioning, where does that end up? It seems to me there's a sort of fundamental old-fashioned argument which is, local government would like to take it over and commission the health service, and the health service would like to commission social care, and that is an argument that's going to just go on and on and get you nowhere. And you kind of get the sense that Bernard and others said, well, the way through this is health and wellbeing boards, which are both and neither. But if you actually made them the commissioners, this would be a structural organisation. The fundamental question is who's the accounting officer? Who's actually responsible for the money? And at the moment, it's CCGs and local authorities. If you say the responsible accounting body is the health and wellbeing, well, that is by definition a structural change. So I think it's a bit naive to pretend that isn't. Or a bit disingenuous to pretend that isn't.
I'm sure you probably all saw that the latest national polling called Michael Ashcroft, looking at what people described as their top 3 issues. When they were asked for the country as a whole, the NHS was ranked 2nd most important issue after the economy. When they were asked for themselves and their families, the NHS was ranked as the 1st most important issue. So it appears to be rising. The Economist Issues Index, the NHS has been bubbling around at 2 and 3, occasionally 4, as what their Ipsos Mori opinion is suggesting is at the top of people's minds.
I have a very heretical view on this, which I actually don't think the NHS decides elections at all. Never has done, ever. I think elections get decided on 2 very, very basic questions, which are broadly, do I think I'll be better off under the next lot, this lot or the other lot, and do I trust the other lot, which is a much broader question. Or trust this lot. It's kind of around trust and economic perception. And sure, things like the NHS bubble up in and out of the campaign, but I don't think they decide a vote.
Nonetheless, if you're
they decide by elections.
If you're anti-Burnham or Miliband, you must, in a cynical sense, be hoping for a crisis winter, because there's no doubt that a crisis winter would mean that in the spring before the May election next year, lots of people would be answering that trust question by saying, no, we can't trust them, i.e. the incumbent government, with the NHS. So I think you're right, but that the NHS does figure in the trust calculation people make, and a bad winter could severely damage the credibility of the coalition government, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a competence issue, really. I mean, if the winter's bad and the government looks bad, then they'll take heed for it, which is probably why Cameron's getting weekly reports on A&E at the moment. I think, the NHS, it's a brand. I don't think universal provision is going to fall apart between now and the election. Therefore, it is really about whether your local NHS stands up to, what they mean in the next few months. And the winter's the key thing, which is why I think it's inevitable money will come up, and why Ed Miliband is saying there's no mention of the NHS, because he's betting that there will be money, and he wants to take credit for pushing the government to saying there will be more money, when in actual fact what they're doing is hedging their bets over winter.
It was interesting that at the NHS Confederation's conference, which is kind of the NHS has its two party political conferences of the year. The summer conference is the NHS Confederations, and the winter conference is the Foundation Trust Networks. And neither Jeremy Hunt nor Andy Burnham gave, they were asked explicitly, any more money coming? And neither of them said, no, there wasn't even a hint. Which is quite interesting, because there's been some noises rumbling around that there's going to be a little bit of extra money found fairly soon to support the 18-week referral to treatment time target. So that seems to be bubbling under. I mean, what in the public mind, people like myself, people like everyone on this panel, who observe this stuff a lot. This stuff is really interesting to us. Most people whom we know who aren't journalists who write about public policy issues, the NHS reforms have been a bit of a something, haven't they? That they essentially, there was enough noise that I think almost everybody realised that the government has done something to the NHS. But there's just not very much noise over what that something was. What are the options that lack of public knowledge, what tools and weapons?
The answer has to be GPs. I mean, the reforms, Lansley reforms, were pegged to empowering GPs. During the passage of the Act, and since, not just the BMA, not just the Royal Colleges and Practitioners, but the High Street practitioner has been saying, I'm in a terrible mood, they're doing horrible things to me, I'm really pissed off, and you're going to have to wait an extra 48 hours to get your appointment. And so in that sense, and in the major access to public opinion that the NHS has in many areas is the GP, and if the GP is saying implicitly or explicitly to patients, it's bad, that cannot be good news for the government. So they've lost, their own reform lost its political credibility by losing GPs, I think.
Yeah, I think GPs have got a lot of answer for. GPs aren't surveyed properly. Their performance is by academic standards pretty bad. I mean, the payments under QIP are quite frankly a joke. And sort of North Korean style 97% payments for people. And GP leaders defend it. They say, well, that's money that we should have been earning. I think that they will be the next target. I think I wrote a lot about care.data. Care.data is premised on the fact that you'll be able to survey for the first time in depth, do a deep dive in your GP and figure out how good he or she is. That is one of the primary moves for it. And I hear what Dave's saying. I do think they're under pressure. I do think they have a lot on. But people go to hospital really when they're when you're having a kid or when you're at the end of your life. And end of life care, quite rightly, Jeremy Hunt has targeted. And anybody with an elderly relative who's having the experience of seeing them being passed from pillar to post in the hospital system via their GP and seeing the inadequacies actually of most GPs to handle serious tertiary conditions, realises just what a gap GPs have allowed in their professional standards, I think. And until we figure out how that works, most GPs, unfortunately, have used Lansley's legislation to nab secondary services. I mean, they're busy setting up dermatology, they're looking at kind of physio, It's very clear, and it's painful, I mean, to say this, but that is our problem, is that Lansley put faith in what he saw was a vanguard of GPs and created organisations that would empower that vanguard, that sort of accountable officer level, but without really, I think, if he was honest to himself, thinking, gosh, what a mess underneath we've got to deal with. And that's the problem. I think the professionalism of GPs is a coming issue, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. I mean, 60Gs have done some good things. I mean, there are places where there are changes in services that are clearly in improvement. I mean, GPs are, I don't know, I don't fully understand actually why GPs appear quite so demoralising. It is true that we've gone through a long period when they've got these huge pay rises. They've now gone through 4 years, I think, where probably the incomes are falling, which is hardly encouraging for themselves. I mean, genuinely falling, not just frozen. And some odd things are happening with the unwinding of old bits of the contract, which are clearly putting some practices under pressure. I don't know whether that's their fault for not foreseeing what was coming, or whether...
The reforms to the minimum practice income.
Yeah, exactly.
They've been in train for about 6 years.
Yes, I know. It's clearly having an impact.
Long signal.
Yeah. So, and general practice is I don't fully understand why, to be honest.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, do we have any questions, comments or observations from the floor?
I've not seen you waving your hands with burning and urgent issues to ask about. Yes, fantastic. Lady in the middle.
Sorry, I do apologise for it always being me. We hear that there's a potential for the repeal of the Health and Social Care Act if Labour get into power. We've also heard some anti-business, anti-competition rhetoric coming from Andy Burnham. And I just wonder if you thought that if Labour came into power, as an industry, should we have reason to be concerned?
Nick, we'll start with you on that.
I'm not sure. Well, if Andy Burnham was the next Health Secretary, there's two things predicated on that. One is that Labour is in government in some way and he is given the job, which may not follow. I mean, he's quite clearly said he wants to go back to a preferred provider thing. He said he will repeal Part 3 of the Act and all the competition disappeared. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a deep suspicion that if you repealing Part 3 of the Act may not change a great deal. Because it's the structure of the NHS market that exists out there with, foundation trusts, a tariff, competitive tendering. You've now got the OFT actively involved with the Competition and Markets Authority actively involved in a way that they weren't before. And a lot of this comes out of procurement law, competition law, Enterprise Act. And simply abolishing Part 3 may not solve the problem. If the problem you're trying to solve is getting rid of competition in the health service. So it's possible you need to go, I mean, I don't know whether this is right, it's possible you need to go further. So you have to actually sort of unpack more parts of the market. So maybe you would have to stop foundation trusts being semi-independent, sort of bring them back in so that they are fully integrated and part of the NHS. You'd have to think about the way you use tariffs and things. So there may be, or you might have to try and legislate to alter some of the competition law and the Enterprise Act, and then you run into European stuff. So I don't think it's entirely clear that getting rid of Part 3 of the Act does what Andy hopes it will do. But it's clear that he says he just sees it as a preferred provider approach. So should that worry you? It depends on what sort of services you provide, doesn't it? If you're actually providing direct health services, then clearly there would be an impact if they were to go down that road. If you're providing equipment and supplies and stuff, that's they will still be needed regardless.
David?
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, if you're Compass, the catering firm, and you're providing meals in a unit, in a hospital health unit, I can see nothing likely to change in terms of your eligibility to be given contracts. If you provide facilities management, again, I think it's those high-profile whole service outsourcings which are potentially in jeopardy. I think if you work for G4S or Serco, you've got a problem because of what's happened recently. Companies as large and prominent as that are going to face issues if there was a change of government. They're going to face issues even if the Conservatives remain in power. But sort of generic outsourcing of functional activity, I cannot see, given how wide it is throughout the public sector, I can't see anything on the political horizon that's likely to change that. But whole services, whole units of service within an NHS setting, I think, as Nick says, that has been identified by Andy Burnham as something Labour would change, so there's bound to be a huge amount of uncertainty around that.
I think yes, in the short term there'll be a bit of a mess. I think they'll have beholden to this rhetoric. You'll see a repeat of, I suppose, the farrago that went under Frank Dobson. Rhetoric about the internal market translating into a sort of mush of policy that needs to become a change. That will sow confusion, if nothing else, through the system, and you'll wait 2 years before they adopt a more hard-headed approach, I suspect. It's one of those political payoffs, not very comfortable for anybody really. That's with the proviso that they're not in coalition with the Lib Dems, and I think then you might be safe.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of keeping to time, if you have any further questions, please grab Nick, Randeep or David after the session. We'll have our last break and then come back to hear from Kieran Devane, Chief Executive Macmillan, on innovating in healthcare partnerships, third sector approaches and keeping a check on the centre. Please remember to fill out your evaluation form, do use them, and please stand with Nick, Randeep and David.